what is grief? What is it? Everyone kind of has heard the term before, but what's the definition of grief?
Yeah. So grief, for me, well, and even like a biblical definition of grief is that it's an affliction or an illness. Like grief is a condition that you experience when you lose someone you love, and it is resolved by the process of mourning. So when you first have grief, when you first experience loss, like grief afflicts you. You have this severe pain from the loss. But then what we need to do is engage in a process of mourning, which is kind of resolving the loss, moving through all the implications emotionally, intellectually, whatever. You do an active process of mourning, and that can and will eliminate the grief, right? And I'm so glad you even asked that question, because there's so many myths and misconceptions and straight up lies that are permeating our culture and our society. This idea that grief never ends and you just learn to live with it, or you grow around your grief, or grief equals love, or as long as you love, you'll grieve. Those are all very dangerous beliefs, and unfortunately, they're very prevalent in our culture. It's why people struggle so long for grief, because they've come into agreement with all these different mindsets. So if listeners can hear, like, grief is not meant to be something that you carry forever. Grief is an acute pain that is meant to be resolved by the process of mourning. And if you are still feeling the pain of grief years after the loss of your loved one, that's a sign that there's still some processing to do. You need to get some help so that you can resolve that.
And everyone, I learned this through our grief journey that we've very much still in the midst of, right? That everyone processes it differently. It rears itself in different ways for different people and for different amounts of time. And so why don't you kind of touch on kind of maybe some of the different ways that grief can present itself in, emotions and that sort of thing?
Yeah. I just want to address what you just said, because it is true, but that also, when we say, well, grief is so personal and the timeline is different for everyone and it shows up different for everyone, those are true statements. But what that is doing is making the solution ambiguous. Like when we say, oh, grief is just this like intangible, incalculable, it affects everyone differently and it lasts different for, like, what you're doing is making the solution harder to grasp.
Okay.
Because the same could be said about weight loss. Everybody's weight loss journey is so personal and everybody's different and it's going to respond to food differently. Those are all true statements.
Yep.
But also there are some guiding principles and best practices that just about anybody can adopt in order to lose weight.
Yep. Absolutely.
So the same thing applies to grief recovery. Yes, it's personal. Yes, it affects people differently. Yes, the timeline is going to be different. But there are some guiding principles and things that you can do that is going to make your grieving time more efficient and make your healing process be accelerated. And so I just always see how quick we are to just describe it that way. Like our culture has so set the definition and tone of grief exactly as you just described it. And that's kind of part of the problem. We need to be able to say, okay, it is personal for me, but here are the things that I can do to mitigate or to move through it and all that kind of stuff. And I'm sorry, I totally rabbit trailed off of your original question. I think your question was, how does it show up for people? Was that the question?
Yeah. How does it present itself? No, but that's great. I love that explanation. I love that kind of, giving examples of relating it to other things. That's awesome.